Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Margaret Wise with Active Prospect, and we appreciate you joining our webinar this afternoon. It has been quite the year in the world of lead generation. The pending FCC regulations have generated emotions during this year that have ranged from everything from shoulder shrug, we'll see, whatever, to fears that it's the end of lead selling. So we've been on a roller coaster of hopes raised when we put forth challenges to the FCC. Hopes were dashed when there were no changes. Hopes were raised again for anti-regulation political hopes, and then dashed again after the election with directives coming out to the FCC saying, put your pens down and don't make any more changes until after the presidential transition. So we have been on quite the ride this year. Today, we're going to recap some of the industry responses to this, both in legal implications as well as talking about practical application. We've got a fantastic group here today to share their perspective and answer your questions. So please join me in welcoming and thanking for their time Alexandra, who's a partner at Manette, Phelps and Phillips. Welcome Gary from Davis and Gilbert, and Craig Reddy from Launch Potato. You've got multiple perspectives here. Alexandra has been focused specifically on consumer protection regulation and TCPA for 10 years. Craig is general counsel at Launch Potato and also is an active technology investor. So very up on all the business and legal news. And Gary's been a partner at Davis and Gilbert for 23 years. So we're bringing a lot of experience here today to share with you, and excited to get started. So I'll stop for a second and see if each of you would like to share just a little bit more about your background. And Alexandra, would you kick us off?
Sure. Well, Margaret, you already teased this a little bit, but I am a TCPA attorney, really in every way, shape, or form. I do class action litigation defense work. I do transactional work, due diligence, compliance, the whole gamut. I've been doing that, focusing on TCPA for a decade now. So I've ridden the roller coaster from pre-omnibus all the way to Facebook and now where we are with the one-to-one consent rule. So really excited to be here, and kind of full circle too, because we were here earlier this year talking about some of these issues.
Exactly. Thank you. Craig.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be with Alexandra and Gary, the heavy hitters today. So Launch Potato is a digital media company that operates in verticals from personal consumer finance to the sweepstakes industry. So we've obviously had countless conversations about the new FCC rules and how to implement them in different verticals. And so I'm excited to share some of those learnings and learn from my colleagues today.
Awesome. And Gary.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm Gary Keibel, a partner with Davis and Gilbert, and I'm a privacy and advertising lawyer. And as Margaret did a good job of pointing out, I've been doing this for quite a long time. So I've seen a lot over the years, going back to the Stone Age of the digital media industry when people really didn't even know what a cookie was. So it's certainly a new world now that we actually have real laws governing a lot of this industry. So it's an exciting time for lawyers. Not much of an exciting time for businesses, but keeping the legal profession very busy.
Definitely. And love to give a few shout outs to the audience. We've got a few people already dropping some notes in chat. Welcome Rosie from Educate You. Welcome Elroy. Welcome Ryan. Welcome Brett. We're really glad to have you guys on, and thanks for already chiming in on our chat. We definitely want this to be interactive today. And in the spirit of being interactive, our first topic is compliance, and we'd love to get the audience involved. And so we're going to run a quick poll now and gauge kind of where everybody is in terms of feeling prepared or getting prepared for one-to-one consent. we have everybody, we'll do a countdown here. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And Blair, will you share results? All right. We've got a pretty good split here. So I see 36% say I'm prepared. So congratulations to you guys. And we hope that you're going to feel the same after today's webinar. We've got 49% still testing. I think that's probably what we're seeing a lot of in the market with our customers and prospects. A good mix there. And then 15%, I'm not prepared at all. And so 15% is a pretty significant amount. So you're not alone if that's the bucket that you are in, and there is still time. So we're glad you're here today to learn more about it. Just as a very quick recap, and particularly for those that are not prepared or those that might be listening to this recording later and learning more about it, the FCC regulations that go into effect on January 27th of 2025 are updates and changes to the TCPA regulations. And so that means that you have to have one-to-one named consent for consumers that you are reaching out and contacting. So they must have consented to be contacted by your brand, and you must be in possession of that proof of consent before you do the outreach. So they must be expecting to hear from your brand specifically, and you must be able to prove that. And they must be expecting to hear from you on the topic that you are reaching out to them for which they are expecting to be contacted for. So those are the very quick and high level is that one-to-one named consent, that possession of consent, and logical and topical are a couple of the phrases that you'll hear. And if you do want to learn more about that, we have a series of webinars on Active Prospects website that we've been doing over the years, over this last year, that you can check in on various topics and learn more about that. So that's just kind of a quick foundation there. And when we were talking and preparing for this webinar with this team, Craig brought up a concept that I really liked the way he titled this and kind of talked about this as the concept of a consent journey. Or consent journeys, right? Because there are different journeys in this process, whether you're a lead buyer or you lead seller, or you play some other role in the ecosystem. So Craig, would you mind kicking us off with your perspective on this? And then we're going to weave into the conversation some other related topics and questions that frequently are coming up.
Yeah. So I've approached this issue from a couple of different perspectives because, as I mentioned in my intro, Launch Potato owns digital media brands in both consumer finance and the sweepstakes verticals. So in our sweepstakes vertical, we had actually already had a pretty decent version of one-to-one consent implemented with a lot of our partners. So there we really had to deal with the logical and topical issue. And the way that we thought about it was, we obviously zeroed in on the language of the rule, which is that the calls and texts must be logically and topically associated with the interaction that prompted the consent, right? So that's a mouthful. It kind of sounds like gobbledygook, but we broke it down to essentially like if you think about let's say survey on a sweepstakes website, right, where a user is answering questions before the ad pops up to be able to give their consent for the advertiser to contact them. Now, if you're just going by the purpose of the website and then an offer, let's say for health insurance, right? If you think about like the purpose of the website as being a sweepstakes website, that's obviously not related to a health insurance ad. But if you think about this as it being associated with the interaction that prompted the consent, and then before you give the ad for the insurance offer, you show, let's say, the user some content about health insurance. or a link to content about health insurance, or you ask a couple of health insurance related questions, then that's a way that you can sort of think about like a mini consent journey there before the person would agree to give their consent for that health insurance company to contact them. So that's the way we kind of thought about it on that side of our house. And, you know, in the FCC commentary, they do talk about the purpose of the website, but thankfully that's not actually in the rule. So for whatever reason, that part of the process, in my view, at least, it got kind of sloppy, and they didn't quite change some of the commentary with the logical and topical piece where the actual rule language is different, right? So we kind of think about it as, you know, we're showing the user some content related to the ad, the offer, and some questions related to, and then they can decide whether to, you know, agree to let this company reach out to them about that offer. And it doesn't really have much to do with the purpose of the website, like whatever that means, as if most websites have a single purpose anyway, right? But that's how we've thought about it on that side of the house. And then on the consumer finance side, you know, we in the past, like, we have not had the one-to-one piece, but the logical and topical piece was kind of already solved. But what we thought about there was, you know, is there a way to sort of, instead of if you think about a traditional funnel, you kind of give that consent at the end of a marketing funnel where, you know, you've given some information, name, email address, phone number, and you've answered some questions. And at the end, you hit consent or submit or agree, right? We thought about, you know, and we've been testing sort of popping up consent along that journey as opposed to at the very end. So a user may not be overwhelmed with like 4 or 5 names at the end, and we would get in front of them much sooner to sort of say like, hey, are you interested in this kind of offer or this kind of company? You know, whereas, you know, instead of like at the end, you would see like 4 or 5 names and maybe the person doesn't know what the name is. So that's how we've thought about these like many sort of consent journeys along the larger marketing funnel.
Got it. That's helpful. And thank you. I appreciate that you're thinking about the consumer experience through that, and that you're, you know, so conscientious about ensuring that you've got consent throughout that. A couple of things that jumped out to me at that I'd love to hear our legal experts chime in is one of the questions that I feel like I've heard a lot over this year that's been one of the hardest ones to answer has been around how do we define what's logical and topical? And then the other is that, you know, how do we handle where there might be multiple, you know, steps along the way, and where are the right steps to capture that consent? What are you maybe legally required to do along that path? So I'll open up to our legal experts to chime in on that. And I am seeing a couple of the questions come in on chat. So after we hear from Gary and Alexandra, we'll pull some of the questions from chat as well.
Yeah, but I think maybe to jump into that a little bit, I mean, you always have to have the balance of where is consent legally required and where is it advisable, you know, and it's good for the consumer. But then we also have the issue of consent fatigue, that people are being hit with so many pop-ups, so many notices, you know, and the more they're hit with, the less they're going to read them. And then we're sort of in a catch-22. It's like you're obligated to get consent from consumers for many different processes. But the more you inundate consumers with so many different disclosures, the more confused they are. You know, a regulator can even argue this is a dark pattern now because people are confused as to what they are consenting to.
It makes me think of cookie banners, right? Nobody pays attention to cookie banners anymore. You just move on and they kind of become meaningless. Yeah.
I guarantee no one except for Alex and I on this call have read the content of a cookie banner, you know, when they go through the website. So, you know, what is the consumer really consenting to? So I think, you know, as Craig was identifying, it's really important to try and make it very clear and in the right point of the journey so that you can argue that this is a very effective consent because it was unavoidable by the consumer, again, logically and topically associated to what we were doing, and it was not mixed up in all these other notices and consents and pop-ups.
Well, I heard several good points from you, Craig. One of them is kind of a basic point, but I want to put an emphasis on it, which is when the FCC came up with this rule, it really was considering one particular use case. But then, when we all know that's kind of like your run of the mill lead gen site where you're getting consent for hundreds or thousands of marketing partners, right? That's what they were trying to stamp out. But the regulations they adopted were very broad, right? They apply to everybody. They apply to prior express written consent, the definition, right? So anyone who's required to obtain that must comply, which presents a lot of interesting questions, including the one that you raised about logical and topical, right? Surely the FCC wasn't considering sweepstakes, when they were coming up with that rule. And we've had, some conversations with the FCC about whether they were considering certain other scenarios, and they just flat said no. Right? But the regulation at the end of the day will apply. So we have to figure out a way for that to happen, which brings me to the next thing I noticed about what you said, which was the consent journey, and what that really entails. I think historically, a lot of sellers would come to me anyway saying, hey, give me the language I need and I'll just stick it up on a page. Well, that's only really part of the issue. The issue is really how you're presenting that. What is the consumer understanding about that consent and how it would be applied and what it would entail and what the scope of that is. And we saw some courts already coming out and saying logically and topically was a requirement before the FCC even brought it up. And so that is not just about the one page you're presenting it on. It's about, this whole experience, which is why I always ask my clients, send me your whole flow. Don't just send me the one page. And that's really what this is an opportunity for. And that brings me to the third thing, which is you pointed out, you're trying some different approaches, right? And that I think is the most interesting piece of this development. Really, forcing sellers and lead generators to examine how they're doing this and consider other ways in which they could collect this consent. Frankly, I think there's a lot of upside in, increasing the likelihood of, a stickiness with that consumer, because the consumer is more aware when they go into this, and when they're making their selection, they're interested in actually receiving the kind of communications they're about to receive. There's no surprise there anymore, right? So when they're giving you that consent, they're expecting it. And that will actually put you in a better position if you're the seller or the caller, right? Reaching out, because now you're not going to have someone who's frustrated and upset by your calls. You're going to have someone who's glad to hear from you.
Yeah, 100%. And I know there's still fair, healthy debate about this, but my view is if the net result of this increases quality across the board and increases that stickiness that you're talking about, where, the reality is people are in the marketplace. They want to get relevant calls and texts, but they don't want thousands of marketing partners to contact them, right? I think we can all agree on that, at least somewhat, right? So if the quality improves on leads, then I think it will end up, helping the industry generally speaking. So I think that, could end up being a net result here that is favorable. And as I said when I did this almost a year ago now, business people that I work with, both in my business and that I've worked with over the years, are endlessly creative. And if nothing else, this is prompting that creativity to bust out of the seams to figure out how to make their business model work. And generally, I think that can produce some really positive consequences in the long run. So
yeah, I think in the FCC report, this issue about small businesses came up, and there were positives and negatives. They were saying that some said this is going to hurt small businesses because it'll be harder to generate leads for their business. And others said in one of the opinions that it would help small businesses because now they'll get quality leads as opposed to, consumers being inundated with messages and businesses being inundated with incoming calls and messages of people that are really not relevant for them. But small businesses will get better customers. So hopefully it works out for the latter, and it's not harder for customers and businesses to generate leads.
Yeah, we've heard, businesses, smaller businesses say, well, it's, the leads are going to be much more expensive now. Can we continue to do that? But on the other hand, getting displayed with recognizable brands, kind of lumps them in with that, gives them maybe a little bit more brand equity, and maybe more people drive to their sites to say, oh, what was this company that they might not have seen before? And so they may actually end up generating some leads that way as well. So we've kind of seen a few things.
Yeah, I mean, if you're paying $1 a lead and 1 out of 20 works out, maybe it's better to pay $5 a lead and 50% of them worked out.
Exactly. We've talked a lot about that. Right. Maybe you're paying more up front, but if you are ingesting less low quality leads, there's a lot of intangible costs for your whole organization, that you're not making as many calls, you're not processing as much, you're not, there's a lot of costs associated with poor leads, as companies know. And if you're weeding some of that out, to your point exactly, it comes out as a net positive. I'm going to jump over to a couple of questions because we've got a lot streaming in. The one that I think I've probably heard most frequently, and it has the most upvotes by threefold here in our Q&A, is, are we required to obtain, prove one-to-one consent for leads that come in before January 27th? And I would love to dive in and answer this. I'm not a lawyer, so I'll defer to our panelists to jump in and provide the legal answer.
Happy to answer this one. So the answer is yes, you need to be obtaining compliant consent for anything that you're going to use after January 27, 2025. And that means also that any leads that you have currently in your pipeline, or any existing customers who've given you prior express written consent, you need to make that consent valid for after the 27th of January, right? So you have work to do, whether you are, planning to roll something new out, or you already have, an existing database of customers that you want to make outreach to.
Yeah, we've tried to help communicate that, certainly, to say, your real date is not January 27th. Your real date is whatever your lead life cycle is, and it rolls back to that, to think about it like that. Another question is in here that I've heard many, many times as well is, can you do the select all? Can you pre-select all the options, have a select all button, and is that compliant to do when you have multiple brands listed?
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in on that one. I mean, regulators for a long time have really disfavored pre-check boxes. And because a pre-check box really doesn't indicate consent. Now, it's possible to develop an interface that makes it very clear what someone's consenting to, but I would, as a default, stay away from pre-check boxes, because you're going to have a very hard time arguing that the consumer knew what they were consenting to.
So I'm going to chime in on this as well. I agree with you, Gary. I mean, my preference always is to avoid the pre-check box. It's not just regulators, right? It's also courts. So I do think you face some risk with that. I will say I have seen a few presentations where I think, in that particular context, that approach could be workable. But I am going to say also that those were not ones where it was just pre-checked and you move through the form. You still have to select the consent language, and then they were presenting below, basically saying, and I'm gonna put it this way: that use case requires consent to both who are being presented there, because of the way that they were doing their calls. So there was even language there to say, look, you can pick one or the other, but in order to get the calls, you have to select both. And so, it's really, this is another consequence of the FCC really looking at a narrow use case and not considering kind of all use cases. So I also want to point out on the seller, checkbox options, this is not just something for lead gens to be thinking about. This is also for brands that are an umbrella company, and then they have multiple brands underneath that umbrella. If you are collecting consent for multiple brands, you may also need to be doing something like this. But at the end of the day, the rule is that you need to allow the consumer to choose who is going to be allowed to call them, and you can't force them to, select all. You can do things to encourage that, but it may impact the enforceability of that consent.
Yeah, I'll jump in just a second too, because to Gary's point earlier, I think you're going to see a fair amount of like dark pattern accusation that goes on in this, because the stuff that we've seen from partners who are kind of big movers in certain verticals, they've sort of sent over their mocks, and I thought, oh, that's an interesting way to do it, because it'll have 4 or 5 partners that you could check, and then it'll have a select all at the top, and the select all is like green box, like basically like Las Vegas flashing lights, like, please check me, like, don't worry with all this other stuff below. And I understand the approach, but I do think that will that'll end up being ripe for some issues around dark patterns or deceptive kind of design there.
Yeah, you have to look at the UX. I mean, because it's not just the words; it's the way it's laid out. It's the size of the font. It's the color of the font. It's the size of the boxes. The FCC, when they give examples of dark patterns, they say they don't want a huge box that says "Yes, I consent" and a tiny little box saying "No, I don't consent." So.
And all of this, right? Like that's true for the FTC. And, the FCC has thrown around some dark pattern language as well, but the courts are doing it, whether they're calling it dark pattern or not. And I think what we're going to see is a lot of these kind of trial and error approaches getting shot down by courts, and that's just something that's going to develop over the next year or 2 years. So buckle up if you're doing that, because you could inadvertently, or maybe knowing the risk, just eliminate the leads that you're working to collect, or the consents you're working to collect. You're going to have to go back and do it again. So, really evaluate whether that is of benefit to you, or if you want to go for a more conservative approach that will kind of net you a lot less headache at the end of the day.
Yeah. I'm gonna jump back to the timing question, because we have another question in here that has a lot of votes, and it's one we certainly hear a lot, is how do we get consent for older leads that we've been contacting for the last couple of years? The question is, how far can we go in contacting older leads that have the new consent? I'm not super clear on that last part, but we have a lot of customers that have asked us, I have a database, I've been contacting them. Like, am I starting from scratch, zero? Do I have an opportunity to do some type of outreach to see if I can get consent? And if I do, how long does that last? Would love to hear your perspectives on that.
There is something really magical about this time of year before this goes into effect. So make no mistake, if you have prior express written consent now and it's going to be vanishing in January, you can still use that now as permission to reach out to these consumers. So if you have prior express written consent for marketing, then you can go ahead and market to them and even ask them to give you this, other consent that you're looking for. You can do it in all kinds of ways. I mean, you can funnel people back through lead flow, new consent flows. You can put people into their account and they can give you consent again there. You can, fashion some sort of outreach. I mean, this is one chance to be making TCPA regulated outreach and still be okay doing it, to ask for this consent. Once January 27th comes around, that opportunity will go away and you will be stuck with non-regulated methods for making that outreach. The other thing I want to point out is, if you're, for the leads question, if you've got real stale leads, query whether or not your consent is adequate for that outreach. And so you need to be a little careful with that. I think stale leads in particular are very ripe for TCPA claims. And even if people did actually give you that consent, I think those tend to churn out a lot more claims. So be cautious with that one.
Yeah. And another good question here that I think represents a good bit of the audience, at least to some degree, is how does the new ruling impact direct response ads? So these people have clicked on an ad, filled out a form purposely to be contacted. Does there still need to be consent given? If it is a direct response ad?
Well, I think it would depend on also what's in that ad. What's the message there? What's the language? What do you say the brand is going to do in response to going through the ad? So it comes down to what they put into that ad. Are you going to build sort of a consent into that ad itself? Or is the ad, to get more information, click here, and there may be a landing page that you get on later on. Then, as Craig said, you're sort of in that consent journey. So it really depends what you say in the ad.
I think one of the things that we think about, and when I've talked about this a little bit, is the spirit of this being, the idea is if somebody fills out a form that they're expecting to be contacted, right? So I think like what you're saying, Gary, is what's the expected result of filling that out? And so the consumers should be expected to be contacted. And that's really what the spirit of the ruling is trying to do for the consumer, I think. So I think it's a great point of like, what was the expectation based on what was in there, or what was, kind of to Craig's point, what was the consent journey that ad might have been part of?
Yeah, I mean, really, when we boil down to all these rules, it's as you said, Mark, it's a very, very, very simple process, and purpose. Does the consumer realize why you're being contacted? Does it make sense to them? I think there was a question earlier in the chat from someone about, well, if we got to do this one-to-one consent, why are we allowed to do multiple sellers as well? It's like, well, if they're properly identified, again, put your consumer hat on. When the consumer gets that call or text message, are they going to think, I know why I'm getting this? It's because I agreed to something. So yes, you can have more than one lead in there that someone's going to consent to. It's all about making it clear to them. And, just pretend that, you are your, 80-year-old grandmother going through the internet and signing up for something. Is she going to understand why she's then getting a phone call later on about what she interacted with online?
Yep. I'm going to ask one more on this topic before we jump to our next topic. And then at the end, we'll try to come back and pick up some more questions. But this has also been a popular one. And this is, do companies need to get consent from current and recent customers? So thinking about that existing business relationship, do they need to get consent to be able to call them with marketing calls?
This is actually a complex question. And the reason for that is because there's multiple aspects of the TCPA that could be in play, right? There's the do not call registry piece. And then of course the internal do not call regulations. Those both apply to telemarketing, but they're, on the do not call registry, you might have an established business relationship exception or, some sort of inquiry or, transaction with the consumer. But if you're using regulated technology, you also need to be concerned with the prior express written consent aspect of telemarketing outreach. So it really depends upon the context, the purpose, the content, and the manner in which you're making that outreach.
Yeah, awesome. That's kind of a perfect segue into our next topic around AI, because you mentioned automated technology. Everybody seems to be doing something with AI. But I think there's a question of, well, what counts and doesn't as it's related to the lead generation regulations? Are there differences in what's impacted if it's calling versus texting? And Alexander, I know this is an area you've invested quite a bit of time and understanding. So I'm going to ask you to share a little bit on your position on this. But before we do that, we're going to run another poll for the audience, and we're going to see how engaged our audience is currently with using AI. All right, so everyone hopefully is chimed in on the poll. We'll do a countdown here. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's see our poll results. Okay, wow. 66% currently using AI. So I'm not, and 20% not currently using it, but plan to. So not too far off the mark there, with everyone's doing something or trying to figure it out. And 14% not currently using it and not planning to. So I know there's been lots of discussion also around that loophole to regulations as well as relates to this. So will you kick us off with your thoughts?
Yeah, well, first, I'm a little bit surprised, honestly, by the poll results. As the panelists know, I asked this very same question in my webinar just about 2 months ago, and I got a much lower response rate for currently using and significantly lower on intend to use. In fact, the majority of folks who attended plan not to. So I think this is an important topic for today, because the AI question has been percolating in the courts a little bit, but it has been especially a large focus for the FCC and other regulatory agencies in the past year or two. In particular. And one of the things the FCC has been doing is evaluating how the TCPA really jives with AI use, how it will apply, and whether there needs to be new regulations. So the FCC late last year issued a notice of inquiry asking about, how does the TCPA apply to AI? There were some of us who were looking at the questions going like, seriously, of course it applies, right? So I'll get to that in a second. In February of this year, the FCC came out with a declaratory ruling basically confirming that when you use artificial or pre-recorded voice, technology, but generated by AI, right? So you have voice cloning situations, you've got any sort of, voice generation that will make the machine sound like a live agent, interact with a consumer, pre-recorded messages that are being generated or delivered by AI. All of those things are covered by the TCPA's artificial or pre-recorded voice provision. And so, what does that mean? Well, that means that if you are using that kind of technology, you're making a call using an artificial or pre-recorded voice, which means you now need to obtain consent under the TCPA. And what kind of consent you need to obtain depends upon whether you're making an informational or a marketing call. But, the FCC was like, make no mistake, the TCPA does apply to AI technology, and this is how. Okay, well, that's one part of the question. There is also, pending proposed rulemaking by the FCC about whether they should go farther on that, on the consent piece, right? Requiring people to obtain specific consent. So a caller would need to obtain consent to use AI technology in making those calls. Potential disclosure requirements. So if you're using AI tech on the call, that you would disclose that fact to the consumer in the call. Even potentially having disclosure requirements surrounding text messages, right? And so that brings up this other issue, and it was like a one-liner in that notice of proposed rulemaking by the FCC, but it's something that we already know is probably true, which is you could be using AI technology in other ways that is not an artificial or pre-recorded voice, but could implicate ATDS calling regulations. And so, if your AI operates in a way that generates calls going out the door, selects records from a list, if you're in a footnote 7 friendly court, you might actually have an issue there. And then the other thing is the FCC said, look, text messages, if they're sent with an ATDS, they're covered. So if you're using AI to generate your text messages and you're using an ATDS, now you have an issue. So I think all in all, the thing to understand is that AI is not some sort of exception or other technology that gets you out of TCPA compliance. It's quite the opposite. So, if anyone remembers RVMs, everyone thought that was like the key, to avoiding TCPA compliance requirements, and that got shut down real fast. This is really very much like that, right? We have technology that operates in a way that already kind of fits within the TCPA existing structure. There may be added requirements for it coming down the pike, but just know you're doing this, you probably have consent requirements. Disclose the fact you're using this kind of technology to your TCPA counsel. You should have a conversation with them about what that means for whether you're allowed to use it and how.
Got it. And Gary, Andrew just posted a link in our chat on some of your comments from earlier in the year. So I know you've got some thoughts as well. Do you want to chime in and share?
Yeah, I mean, we focus a lot on what the FCC is doing and the FTC, but the states are being very, very active here. And so we now have two states that have enacted new AI laws, Colorado and Utah. The Utah law is currently in effect. The Colorado law takes effect, I believe, in early 2026. And these laws require disclosure to the consumer about the fact that they're interacting with an AI platform. The Utah law is mostly simply a disclosure one, but the Colorado law requires a lot about doing impact assessments, about whether you are a deployer or a developer of an AI system, sharing information about how your AI system learns and trains on data, and making a lot of disclosures public about that, while still protecting your trade secrets. So if you're going to be using any AI service, if you're the developer or even the deployer of the AI service, you may be implicated by these new state laws. And if you're just using someone else's service, you certainly want to make sure that they are complying with all applicable laws. And actually in California, there's been a chatbot law in the books for, I believe, over a decade about disclosing to a consumer whether or not they're interacting with a chatbot or a real person. So very important to look on the state level as well. And this is going to increase. We're going to see many, many more states coming on board with AI laws in 2025. So the landscape is going to get much more complex.
Very, very interesting. I know for one, I think it was last holiday season, I was trying to return something on Amazon and I was asking, are you a person or are you a bot? Like, prove it to me. So, Craig, I would love to hear your perspective on, how you guys are looking at AI. You got a little bit different perspective from where you are, and how did you answer the poll?
We use it a little bit, not so much in consumer facing interactions, but we use some machine learning technology that we actually developed internally on some of our like back-end systems, and in ways that we kind of rotate some offers often on different pages of our website. So we definitely use it for operations and things like that, but we have not gotten much into the consumer interaction side. So that's why I was mostly quiet during this segment.
Yeah. Got it. Great. Well, I think that's really interesting how you're using it operationally as well. I think, it would be fun if we had more time to break that poll down and learn more about how people are using it in all areas of their business. So I think we'll go now to our final topic, which I've been excited to hear about, which is, thoughts for 2025. We've got one final poll. We're going to ask the audience for a few thoughts on where they think the biggest impact and liabilities are going to be with that. So we'll run that third poll really quickly here. And then I see that launched here. So we'll give everybody a second or two to answer on where they think the greatest liability is going to be. And I'm going to put my vote in, and we'll do a countdown here. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's see what our results are. Okay. Interesting. We've got 18% think the biggest liability would be increasing cost per lead. So not as much there. 39%, significant drop in lead volume. Yep, definitely have heard a lot of that. And then 43%, the winner on legal disputes. So Gary, what do you think is going to happen in 2025? What should we be thinking about?
Yeah, no, I think, significant drop in lead volume and legal disputes, definitely a lot, and increased cost per leads, it's all going to happen. And then, we have uncertainty going into 2025. At the top of the hour, we spoke about that, after the election, Senator Ted Cruz and the House Energy and Commerce Chair, Kathy Rogers, both sent notices to the FCC saying, pens down, you're not doing anything further until the election, until we have the change in administration. I think we're much too far down the road here. That's not going to happen with this, but there are going to be other things that are going to change. I think most importantly and impactful for the marketing industry will be a change in leadership at the Federal Trade Commission. The chairwoman, Lena Khan, has taken a very aggressive approach on many different issues. mean, the FTC really mostly regulates deceptive and unfair practices and has taken an incredibly broad view of that. Just yesterday or the day before, there were 2 announced enforcement actions against data brokers about selling sensitive personal information. And one of them, I think, introduced a really unique thing about a prohibition on bidding on lost bids in the RTB bid stream. So, the FCC really, really aggressive right now. I was at one event recently where there were some regulators there, and somebody was saying, well, if you're involved in an FCC investigation, what should you do right now? And one of the panelists said, delay, delay, delay. But I mean, I don't think it's all going to change, just after the inauguration date in January. It's going to take months until there's new commissioners at the FTC. But I think eventually we are going to see a change, not a change saying that there's not going to be as much regulatory action. I think we're going to see a change in regulatory priorities. And we have to wait and see what those priorities are going to be. Then, in addition, as I mentioned, the primary area of my practice is in privacy law, and that is changing radically with all the new state privacy laws. And it'll impact this industry and the things we're talking about today. Because as we sit here today, we have 8 states that have new comprehensive consumer privacy laws on the books. In about a month and a half, it'll be up to 12 states. 19 states have passed them. And there are some unique things lurking in these laws that people may not be paying attention to. If you read Ad Exchanger, I had an article come out actually a couple of hours ago in Ad Exchanger about new privacy laws in Maryland. And there's a data minimization requirement in Maryland that's going to kick in, which basically says that you're only collecting the personal data that's reasonably necessary or proportionate to provide a product or service requested by the consumer. So that gets more to disclosures and consent, that you can't be collecting additional personal information beyond what the consumer is requesting. So we talked earlier about consent fatigue. I think that's going to increase because you're going to have to hit people with more disclosures, more pop-ups, more notices so that you can use data in other ways that they may not be expecting. So I think what we see going forward is regulatory uncertainty, more state laws, an increase in state laws, certainly more private litigation as well, because class action lawyers like to kick the tires on these new rules. And that's going to create more compliance obligations for businesses.
Yeah, thank you. That's there's a lot of resources you dropped there for people to go chase and start learning even more about. Just when we thought we were getting our arms wrapped around this year, right? We already got to start thinking about next year.
Well, it kind of reminds me. I think when I gave my first speech, maybe back in 2019, and explaining to a marketing audience about CCPA and the California Consumer Privacy Act. And I was in a room about 100 marketers, and I said, this new law is bad for every single person in this room, except for me. And it's the sorry truth that with all these new laws and requirements coming out, it just, increases the burden on businesses and increases the need for, legal oversight and compliance.
It really is overwhelming. And especially when you think about, you're all potentially engaging business in every single state. So you can't think about just where you're registered or where's your primary business happening or where are your top customers. I mean, ultimately, especially now the remote working and everything else, is just like the whole concept of cell phones and who you're calling and what time zones they're in, all of that. So it is super complicated.
Yeah. And maybe I'll add to that, Mark. You're saying about all the different states. Sometimes clients come to me and say, Gary, just tell me the state with the strictest standard and I'll just do that. And the problem is there is no one state with the strictest standard. The strictest standard is as a medley of all the different states put together.
Yeah,
so
I was thinking that when we were talking about Colorado, right? I was
exactly.
like, oh, that's interesting. That sounds like they're giving California a run for their money.
Yep, exactly.
Craig, from a business perspective, how are you navigating all of this and what are you preparing for in 2025?
Yeah, it's just on the one-to-one consent piece for a second. So I think the morning after the election results, right? I messaged our executive team. I was like, listen, nothing's going to change in the short term. Like, don't start preparing that this is not going to happen, at least in the short term. I said, it's possible that if, whenever new members of the commission get on and there's a new chairperson that, they want to roll some of this back maybe, but this can tend to be a bipartisan issue, and it won't surprise me if it stays in some form longer term, right? So I my advice to our businesses are like, we need to prepare as if this is going to be the rule for the long haul, and we shouldn't do anything different than what we're doing right now, which is preparing for this to be the case, and also preparing for, the rule in April around, revoking your consent in any reasonable manner, the time frame, all that stuff, right? So that could change too, but until there's some sort of signal around those things, you have to prepare as if it's going to go into effect. So that's been how I've been thinking about this specifically. And, and the risk with this is, it's so many things in regulated industries, the risk is around, a potential government action. But of course, here at the TCPA, the big risk is a class action, litigation. And it's very expensive. And, speaking as someone inside a business, there's not a lot of great insurance options for TCPA coverage, right? Like it's a difficult, insurance policy to get that is actually helpful. So the big risk here is the incentive is going to be for class action attorneys to test these things out right away. And if you're not buttoned up right away, like you do run a substantial risk of getting into one of these class actions, and then you're looking at 6 figures just to get through like initial stages, and it's a very difficult process even at the beginning stages to get through. So be buttoned up as much as you can right away.
If I may, I would be super remiss not to give a quick plug for Trusted Form as good insurance. Not technically insurance, but we'll give you proof of what happened in that lead capture, and you can use Trusted Form Verify to check for that consent. So sorry, I had to do one plug there. There is something you can do.
Actually, I was going to jump into what Craig said when he said the word insurance. And it's important what you said, Margaret, but you should consider your real insurance. I mean, do you have a cyber insurance policy? Do you have an advertising marketing practices insurance policy? And look at it closely.
Yes.
They may carve out TCPA violations.
Yes.
So you should have insurance for your business, but it's not enough to just pay the premium and sign the dotted line. You got to look at what the carve-outs are. It used to be back in the early days of privacy, they were carving out certain privacy laws. So you want to look and see whether TCPA violations are covered.
Yeah.
Great advice. And Alex, you want to give us your final predictions, or I shouldn't say your final, but predictions going into 2025?
Yeah, well, I'm going to side with all the people who said litigation. I think that all the FCC regulations, frankly, are ripe for that. And there's a lot of reasons why. I mean, one is that the plaintiffs' bar will not be deterred. They want to exploit gray areas. They know that companies do not want to be the first guinea pig out there. And so you're going to see a lot of plaintiffs' counsel coming out of the woodwork to, both low hanging fruit type, they just want to be paid off, and the regular heavy hitters that we all know about. And on the regular heavy hitters, I wanted to flag a few things that I've seen them doing lately that I think will continue into next year. One of them is we're seeing a lot of internal do not call claims. Those are claims that, your company doesn't maintain the appropriate policies and procedures to make telemarketing calls. And I know lots of companies that don't have internal do not call policies they can produce on demand, and maybe aren't properly implementing their revocation rules and things like that. And if you are not ready, those lawsuits can be quite devastating, right? Because all it takes is one consumer to bring a class action, and now you have a potential hairy problem that you have to deal with, and you're not going to be in a good position. So one of the best things you can do is really prepare for that kind of a scenario so that you have defenses lined up when the time comes. The other thing I'm seeing is, there's been some percolating arguments around the e-sign Act disclosure issue and whether or not e-sign Act disclosures, not just, an e-signature, are required for prior express written consent. I think there are a lot of reasons why that argument really shouldn't fly, but there's been a couple of courts that have been bamboozled into this, thinking. And if you don't have counsel who are ready to put forth the important and appropriate arguments for that, you might be caught flat-footed. I also think there's just risk with it. It's something that, is going to be tested time and time again. So if you're doing things like collecting consent on a recorded call, right? These are things that are potentially in question if the e-sign Act challenge gains steam. And then last, we've got this post-Loper world, and the TCPA has Hobbs Act issues that haven't yet really been examined in full. I know there was a petition for certification at the Supreme Court for this issue. And so, maybe there is some opportunity to challenge existing regulations given that posture. But at the end of the day, we'll have to give it time for courts to really examine and apply the rules there. So all in all, I think the litigation area is going to be heavy next year. And, like I said, get ready now by doing things you can do. So I'm going to give my own little plug, which is if you sign up for our Manat newsletter, there was a link to do that, that Active Prospect put up. But if you do that this week, we're actually going to be sending out a checklist for year end, things you can be doing to prepare for next year. And that's a great resource, right? Because now active steps, what it is you need to do to get ready.
That's fantastic. Thank you. We've got just a couple minutes left, and I'm just going to squeeze in a few more quick questions here. I think they're in line with, Alex, what you'll probably have in your checklist. So I'm sure everybody is going to get that. But they're asking, can we send out text and emails now to get that consent, which I think you alluded to a little bit earlier, but just clarifying that. And then also, if people just respond with a yes, is that considered consent?
So, the most popular attorney response is it depends. It really depends. It depends on the context. So for example, the questions about consent, right? Well, can you reach out to get consent using a regulated method? Maybe, but you have to have adequate consent now to do that. So, it depends. Same thing goes with, if the response yes is an e-signature, it depends. What did you ask this person before they said yes, right? And did you give the necessary disclosures? And so that is something that your attorney really needs to review and help you with. But I think, the kind of broader responses, there are solutions to a lot of these things, and you really just need to kind of dig in and figure out how to work it into your situation.
Yeah, I think that's a great one to wrap up on. I think you had a couple of great points there around there are things you can do now. We are in this magical period. This is the time to capture that consent, do those things, make sure everything you've got in your database, you're trying to capture that consent and ensure you're buttoned up to minimize the impacts for January 27th. So I want to thank you guys so much for joining us. I think we're going to put up some links, or we've got them in chat from our team posting additional resources. Of course, on Active Prospect website, again, we've got recordings of webinars that we've hosted throughout the year with lots of experts on the topic. And so I want to say to our panelists, thank you so much for taking time. I know it's a very busy time of year, and I know all of our audience really appreciates you being here and sharing your knowledge. To everyone live with us today, we had a lot of questions come through. We're going to save those, and we're going to try to get more responses out one-on-one if we did not get to your question in the webinar. And to everyone listening to the recording as well, we're wishing you a wonderful holiday season and a healthy, happy, and prosperous new year. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.